Hello and welcome everybody. Nice to see you all here on yet another Friday evening with the Irish Influence. And our guest this evening is Dominic Bryant, and the person who's going to introduce him is Michael Cronin. But even before he does that, please, let me just remind you to send in your questions there in the Q&A, as you'll see down below at the bottom of your screen in all likelihood. And one more thing, and that's, of course, to thank, as always, the Consulate General in Boston for their assistance in doing all this. Thank you very, very much, Alicia. Thanks very, very much. Mike.
Thank you, Joe. So tonight we've got Dominic Bryant, who is an anthropologist, and he's in the School of History, Anthropology and Philosophy and Politics. There's too many words there. At Queen's University in Belfast. The author of so many works I can't even begin, to be honest. Orange Parades 2000, Transforming Conflict, Flags and Emblems. We'll get to flags later, 2005. The Politics of Community 2014, and then Belfast Urban Space Policing and Sectarian Polarisation in 2020, and a whole load of reports and things as well. He is the Flag Commissioner for Northern Ireland, which again we'll talk about later, and lots of other random things we can talk about. So welcome, Dom. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Evening, everyone.
And we've got to apologise in advance. Dom's been in a conference on Zoom in America all day, but clearly not in America, in Belfast. So he's probably been Zooming for 5-6 hours, Dom, by this point.
Yeah, talking about lots of statues.
So if he just keels over in the middle of it, we know what's happening. So there we go. So Dom, let's begin with at the beginning. The strange thing for you, obviously you're like me, you're English, but you actually studied in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, which for most English people during the Troubles, that was not a natural kind of destination to head off to. So why, how Northern Ireland?
Well,
and what did you make of it? I mean,
when I got to the University of Ulster Coleraine, I went through clearing because I'd been already thrown out of one university, it was Kingston Poly at the time, and then I'd run a slightly dodgy business in London. If you've seen Only Fools and Horses, I ran a business exactly like that in South London. And had a warehouse in Peckham as well. I did it, and was going nowhere with my life. And my mum started ringing up universities. I was interested in anthropology, and anthropology, as you know, tends to be taught in the sort of more elite ones. So you've got your Oxfords and your Cambridges and LSE, but fantastically, the University of Ulster Coleraine taught, and my mum persuaded them to take me. And when I got to the University of Ulster Coleraine, there were lots of sort of English, Scottish and Welsh people there, all went through clearing. All of them had the same story, that they had mothers who had tried to persuade them not to go to Northern Ireland in the mid-1980s. I was the only one who had a mother who begged him to go. And it was truly life-changing, moving from London up to a place like Coleraine and Portrush. And my experience of it, and I think quite a lot of people might have this when they go to Northern Ireland. They've got an image of conflict about the place. And I think even then, even in the 1980s, if you just arrived there, you sort of, particularly North Antrim, I have to say, it sort of felt normal. It sort of felt okay. And you sort of looked around and you thought, what's the issue here? And I think this is particularly true now, only when you start to live and understand what this part of the world is like, do you start really understanding how deep the social relationships and divisions are, and how everyday life is impacted by the division of whatever we want to call it, being British or Irish or Protestant or Catholic. And I think that was my experience, that I was in some sense surprised how easy and good and it was. And then only after an amount of time did I start to spot the differences. Indeed, I'll tell you, the first occasion was on a St. Patrick's Day. The University Soccer Club used to have a Protestants versus Catholics game. Yes, in 1984. I know, on St. Patrick's Day. And they used to walk out of the changing rooms holding a Union Jack and a tricolour. This is up in Coleraine, by the way, and sing the national anthems. The awkwardness for me, of course, in what I understood, is that having come from a Catholic background, I ended up, after only a few months there, walking out on the Catholic team and obviously not singing the national anthem very well, but miming it. So it was quite an experience.
And the one thing, obviously, you're there and you stay there. We'll talk about why you stay there and what you do later on. But you've got this background, and you and I were chatting the other week about various things to do with kind of identities on this island, and you and I drifted into a conversation about music, which is one of your great passions in life. For those of you who don't know Dominic, he is just encyclopedic in his knowledge of music, which he passes on to his children because they have no choice. They listen to what they're told. But the one thing that came up in our conversation was a discussion about music during the years of the Troubles. Yeah. But you think about Troubles, and it has a kind of literary backdrop. It has people like Heaney, etc. But at one level, conflict produced talent. But just on the issue of music, why does nothing seemingly, there's odd bits and pieces, why does nothing emerge from the North?
I think it's very telling. It may have been that my previous 10 years to being here was in a small town suburb outside London called Woking, which was the home of Paul, still is the home of Paul Weller and the Jam, and is in fact the town called Malice. So when he wrote around the town called Malice, it's the place I came to. He was dead right as well. And so I've thought over the years, I've been quite interested in the sort of ridiculous game and seeing where and when do bands and movements get produced. You know, you think of Coventry and Two Tone and things like this. And Belfast in that period, at one level, now I'm going to insult people here, so I better be careful, produces almost nothing. And in a way, the movie Good Vibrations and Terry Hooley stuff is almost proof of that, in the sense that it's a story about the tiny little world that did happen despite everything. All right, and in a way, I think that's quite telling, that you don't have the sort of urban rock bands going it forward. You know, Derry obviously has the undertones of, obviously Belfast has had Van Morrison, which is probably lived out on far too long. But after that, it's really difficult, all right? People will say Stiff Little Fingers, but I think they had 2 top 40 hits in all. I think their version of Johnny Was by Bob Marley's song is about the best live song I ever saw, all right? So that there are high points, but there's very few. And I think it's about the space. And in a way, a lot of work I've come and looked at since, trying to develop in the sort of spaces you were in Belfast, when almost every music setting would have demanded that you behaved in one way and another, where you'd have had national anthems at the end of events, was an extremely difficult environment. And isn't it telling that if you talk about poetry in Belfast during that period, you've got a wonderful, I mean, you said a few, Carson and McGuckian and as well as obviously Seamus Heaney and Manhattan. I mean, there's so many of them. The poetry is amazing as a cultural repertoire. And I just think the space for that sort of rock and pop music wasn't there during the Troubles.
And is that because there's a cultural producer like a poet is literally sitting in their own bedsit, front room, whatever it may be? They're not having to negotiate, as you say, the idea that if you're in Woking, if you're in Coventry, like I was, you go into a club. Yeah, there's always going to be inclusions and exclusions, but it's not against a backdrop in the same way it would be in Belfast. Is that why the kind of the musical side of things struggles? I suspect it must be. I suspect that, because otherwise it doesn't make sense, because both Irish and British cities all have their periods of time. You don't have to spend any time thinking about Manchester or Sheffield or quite obviously Liverpool or Glasgow and the rock bands that come from it. So you can't be too mechanistic about how culture works, but you also look at it and say, there's something going on there. There was something that made the development of that sort of, for want of a better word, pop or rock culture at that time almost impossible. And as you say, on the other hand, the more private space where poetry produced seemed to flourish. So it's not as if conflict, I mean, I think conflict
clearly produces amazing stuff. There's loads of evidence of that. What it didn't do is, I think, allow a decent response from the sort of popular rock era. It just doesn't seem to have come about.
Okay. So we're going to come back to space. But there you are in Coleraine, but obviously you move on and you do the PhD and you work as an anthropologist. So what in this, again, conflict setting, it's not as if you go off and go somewhere else in the world, you stay there. What can an anthropologist bring to our understanding of conflict? And what did it set off in your head that you thought this is a way to pursue this landscape that you're at one level living as an outsider, but as the years go by, you're becoming an insider?
Yeah. I mean, anthropology sort of saved me. I think it's an amazing discipline. All right. I'm a bit biased now that I teach it all the time. But the one thing it gets for me is that because you're spending time in a particular space, so the research methodology is so blindingly simple that we struggle to write, but we do manage, of course, like all good academics, to write books about almost nothing. Because the methodology really is you stay in one place a long time and you learn about how people behave, react, how they view the world. And at one level, it's as simple as that. But what you get for that time is, I think you get an analysis of informal world that you can't really get. A bit like saying this is a beer that reaches the parts that other beers can't get. It's a discipline and a methodology that reaches the parts that other methodologies struggle to get to. And let me give you an example of that would have come out in my research. If you look at something, if I spoke to Orangemen about why they parade and who they parade with and what their beliefs are, they would have been, most of them would have been very opposed to paramilitarism, obviously of the IRA, but also of the UVF and the UDA. And yet you're looking at a parade and you're seeing all of these symbols and all of these bands, which were obviously connected to loyalist paramilitaries. And in that methodology, you've got time to start looking and asking questions and trying to work out the worldview, because these Orangemen aren't lying to you about what they believe. They're not covering all of this up. And it gives you, so I think the ethnographic methodology is actually a very powerful one. Has lots of weaknesses, but it's getting at that informal world. It's getting the everyday life stuff that I think makes it such a rich way of looking at all worlds, but particularly in conflict.
You're not the first anthropologist that we've had here, Dominic. It's a few weeks ago since we spoke to Henry Glassy, who, like you, came from a different place and, like you, committed himself to Ireland, and like you, was involved to one degree or another actually with the Troubles. That's to say, is that he arrived in rural Ireland back in the 1970s. But you have different methodologies, you have different approaches, and maybe you've come to different conclusions. Anything that you'd like to say about means of?
Well, I think there's a sort of way anthropology, as you know, in its early forms, and we can date anthropology in different ways, but broadly within the British tradition, if you like, it comes from the 20s and 30s of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown. And what you did is you went and you examined holistically small communities. All right. So instinctively, you sort of headed off to the village or the Hawaiian island or something like that. There were times when I stood watching parades in snow in Lurgan that I wondered why I didn't choose a Hawaiian island. But many of the early anthropologists in Ireland would have sort of done that in the right up to when Henry Glassy was there. When you picked the rural, because you were trying to capture holistically how a particular, what you would have called a community or a village takes place. But the interesting thing about that is that sometimes, because those places sort of worked, you created a description of how they functioned. And that's a certain irony in Northern Ireland, because many people view Northern Ireland as a place that doesn't function and has lots of conflict. And the anthropologist that started to pick that apart was the amazing Rosemary Harris, who did her field work as an MA student in Tyrone in the mid-50s, and then published in a book, I still think a great book called Prejudice and Tolerance in Ulster. in 1972. So think of her doing her research in the 50s. What's happening in 1972? And you'd think already the work would have lost relevance. And you'd think by now you wouldn't be able to give it to anybody to teach, except that she really dissects the relationships between Protestants and Catholics in this village in Tyrone. And like many anthropologists, and this is what's interesting about it, sort of shows how the village functions despite the division. So whereas a lot of disciplines start with the idea we're going to look at Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland because of its conflicted divisions, ironically, the anthropologists started by saying, well, how the hell is it working? And showing that in many ways, many of these places did work. So I mean, I think that's in one way what anthropology did offer. What then happened in the 80s and 90s, inevitably, is that we went urban. And a lot of the, more latterly, the anthropologists that worked moved into those urban settings where you can't do holistic village research. So you tend to look at rituals, you tend to look at symbols, you tend to look at walls, you look at all of those things that, and you use that as your research center. And most of us, you know, I can think of people who looked at the Irish language in urban settings. You know, I can think, obviously there's parades and that sort of thing, commemorations. That's the sort of work that has gone on since. What it maintains, however, is an ability to look at the informal, is an ability to get under the skin of why a particular paramilitary gets a memorial and others don't. I mean, we know sometimes why that happens with official memorials. Why with unofficial memorials does that particular UDA leader get a memorial when others haven't? And that's, I think, still the power of ethnography and anthropology.
Can I just press that for 1 second, actually, the power of anthropology in situations like the North? To what degree does that actually infuse itself into the production of solutions? Or is this an entirely academic exercise? You're producing books and reports and things like that, but does that actually work for ordinary people?
Anthropology in some ways in Britain or in the UK has been a bit of a disappointment in that sense, I think. We were very late onto how policy works, and after the 1990s that did develop. Prior to that, I mean, you know, we carry our own guilt around anthropologists. You know, we went around to those colonial places and we nobly perhaps recorded the lives, and to use a horrible phrase, of the natives, but that's how it was sort of viewed in a way that I think was powerful and useful, but nevertheless part of that colonial scheme. You know, Evans Pritchard, I think famously whilst writing the Nur, managed not to mention that the British were also bombing the Nur at the same time, you know, because he was trying to write the sort of authentic lives of these people, for which in some ways we're very grateful. But more latterly, anthropology has started to look at policy, and I found it because you get a feeling for, I hope, the sort of grassroots, it's such a cliche, grassroots, but what's going on in everyday life. I think you can bring that to policy discussions. So, you know, in stuff that I've looked at around flags, you know, you can make all these statements about what the flags mean, but if you look at who puts the flags up, if you do that sort of research, you get the interesting question like, so only men put flags up, do they? Well, actually, only men tend to put flags up. It's groups of young men or groups of men that go around putting the things up. And that allows us to ask a much more interesting and detailed question that relates to how those communities work. And although the civil service and others often prefer their pie charts and their quantitative stuff, I think there's a role, and I think we've proved it, for qualitative work like that in a place like Belfast.
Thanks very much. And just before Mike takes over there, I'd just like to tell people, I see a couple of people putting up hands there, and thank you very, very much, but we can't actually go over to you with your hand up there. So please, what you might do actually is just write your question into either the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll present it there. So thanks very much, Mike.
And then continuing, Dominic, with this whole idea of, you know, the function of the anthropologist and the function of yourself, as it were. Clearly, again, the sheer longevity of your years in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, you've gone through conflict, you've gone through a peace process, and then obviously now 2 decades or so of a post-conflict society. Is the kind of things that you're doing, or maybe the question you're asking, did they transform over those years? Or are you still looking at the same society, asking the same questions, but those issues are just existing in a slightly different frame, conflict versus post-conflict?
I think they have transformed. I mean, doing the work has changed, all right? Frankly, the sort of research I was doing in the 1990s, I mean, I didn't at the time feel it was desperately unsafe. You know, following parades around, watching riots. Although if I now described, if a student came to me now with the research project I did then, I'd be saying you can't do it because the risk and the ethics, you wouldn't be allowed to do it. So I didn't feel it was that dangerous, and I still don't feel that it was. But if I look back on it, the environment one was working in was very, very different. You know, it wasn't easy to go from talking to someone in the Shankill to talking to someone in the Falls directly. Crossing those boundaries carried risks. I, in the 90s, walked into police station and interviewed police officers over parades. That had its own apprehensions at the time for obvious reasons. None of those apprehensions exist now. But what you've also got now, I think, so being free to a great extent of that sense of threat makes a huge difference. But you've also got a much more interesting, I think, a really dynamic sort of space happening at the moment, and a more diverse space. And it makes you think in more diverse ways. And in many ways, you could accuse a lot of us at that period for being obsessed by, and I'm going to use a cliche, the orange and the green at the time, all right? And looking at stuff that men do a lot. You know, I think it would be a mistake for any researcher to get caught in that now. There are still some that come around like that, but I think it's a mistake for any researcher to get caught in that now. So I think that environment has changed quite dramatically.
I'm just going to ask a question about flags themselves, if I may, actually. A flag burning. Anything to say about flag burning? Are you in favour of it? Are you against it? What do you think?
Well, over the years, Joe, I've toyed. One of the things that changed in the research that I did is once you start going into policy, all right, and looking at these things not as just cultural artifacts that people are doing and asking why they're doing it. Once you go into policy, you've got to say, well, what do laws say about this? How do you best reflect people's rights in it? And you know, infamously in the US, you know, they've had, I think almost every state in the US at some point has tried to introduce a law to stop the burning of the US flag. And I think it's struck down all the time. There's 2 or 3 very good books that look at just flag burning in the US alone. And I tend towards that end of the spectrum as saying that, broadly speaking, banning that sort of stuff is problematic. And that burning a flag is some sort of a democratic right. It's a form of free speech. However, I think within conflict environments, I am very keen on discouraging anything like this. I often say the thing I hate most is the burning of effigies on bonfires.
Burning people is a different thing from burning symbols.
Particularly the effigies of real people. So I would defend people's right to burn flags, although I would struggle as much as I can in the setting that you're in to try and persuade people that it's not a good idea. Just as out of interest, I tried to persuade people that taking a tricolour out on St. Patrick's Day in Belfast is not necessarily a good thing. And I've got my reason, not because people don't have the right to do it, but if they wanted to make St. Patrick's Day a day that everybody feels welcome, then our tricolour and our Union flag have to sort of be left at home at the moment.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Go ahead.
But isn't that in a way one of the big issues, Dom, that you talk about? Obviously, one thing you've really kind of worked on is the idea of shared spaces, particularly within urban spaces within the North. But the creation of shared spaces does actually mean sort of downing tools in a way on identities, doesn't it? I mean, here's your thoughts.
Yeah, no. Here's what I think. I've thought about this long and hard, and how you create a shared space. When we started working on shared spaces in Belfast, when it became part of the policy area, there was an idea that the space therefore has to be neutral. All right, and I think that was a mistake. I don't really know how a space can be neutral in that way. I think that's a mistake, and here's the reason I came to think that being able to express your identity in civic spaces, in public spaces, I think is key to feeling a citizen in that place. It's key to feeling a part of it. And we know that because for much of the history of Belfast, Catholics or nationalists or Republicans couldn't do that. And in a way, we create a more peaceful Belfast or a more peaceful Northern Ireland. We know it was when Catholics and nationalists, Republicans could feel comfortable in those spaces without necessarily having a united Ireland, but they had every right to have that identity in those spaces. So in that sense, being able to parade into the centre of Belfast waving your Irish tricolour is vital, because it gives you a sense of citizenship. You're from Belfast, you can be Irish in the centre of Belfast. So in that sense, I learned that the space can still be shared. Now, you've got a problem if you've got two groups doing that and they're in opposition, and you've got to police that. But broadly speaking, you don't want to neutralise your civic spaces. You want to make it a space where people can express their senses of identity. Now, the other part of it that is important is you also want to create lots of events where people don't either express their Britishness or their Irishness. I mean, a good example of something that's moved on fantastically has been the Pride event in Belfast. And for good civic culture, if you like, you need lots of those events where people from Belfast are also sharing those events without their British and Irish identity. So I would argue that a good shared space has both of those things in, where you can be your political person in that space on sometimes, but you also can be a whole lot of other identities at the same time. That, I think, makes us a stronger society. And that, I think, makes us different from the one we had 50 years ago.
That's great.
And is that, I mean, just going back to, I mean, in terms of the creation of that kind of shared space, I mean, clearly one thing long-standing, well over 100 years, is that you looked at in your book of 2000 was Order Parades and the power of them. And the subtitle always fascinated me because it sums up so much. The subtitle was The Politics of Ritual, Tradition and Control. And that seemed to sum up much of Northern Ireland, the struggle between two traditions who are both trying to control the other. But what strikes me is, are those traditions public display, like Orange Orders, on the 12th every year, and the bonfires and everything goes with them, or St. Patrick's Days, or Republican Parade, are those things becoming less powerful?
I think, on the whole, that they are. All right. Now, it's a very difficult thing to map over time, but we've got what we know about traditions, and this goes back to sort of work of Hobsbawm and Ranger, is that traditions aren't customs that last a long time. Traditions are things that people believe have lasted a long time. So they're legitimized as being long living. What we know about them, and this is what my book on the parades was all about, is actually they're changing all the time. You can take any tradition. You know, sometimes in the classes when I was teaching the parades, if that wasn't working, you just talk about the tradition of Irish dance. And even in the time I've been in Ireland, look at how that has changed. You know, the influence of America, the influence of all sorts of things. The debates within Irish dance that they'll have about what way they should be doing it. So that tradition, oddly, those things that last the longest are usually the ones that have adapted and changed the most. So on that basis, firstly, you can't see those, you know, I don't I don't see those traditions as being static. All right. The second thing to say is that describing them as two traditions or two cultures, I think is enormously problematic. I usually say we have one culture. All right. You can't, in the end, somebody in a Hibernian parade and somebody in an Orange parade are broadly doing the same thing. Surely they're doing the same thing. Surely that's from the same space. They're wearing just different colour sashes. Heavens, the blooming person depicted on the banner usually fought in the same battle on opposite sides, but in the same battle. You can't talk about that being two different cultures or even two different traditions, in my view. And the way I would do it is I talk about cultural identities. All right, they're the same culture, but they have different cultural identities. And those cultural identities, all right, are about boundary markings. So those things become very important. So a lot of the similarities that everybody has disappear into the background when those cultural identities come to the foreground. All right, and that's the better way of modeling what takes place. And if you accept that change is taking place over time, then you can see those identities shifting over time. And let me give you one simple example. Even in the time I've lived here, unionism in the past would have been obsessed about, you know, Rome rule, Dublin rule being Rome rule, and that their unionism was based on not wanting to be a part of a Catholic island, and popes were burnt on the top of bonfires. That's all gone. I mean, effectively, you'll have some in the DUP who will talk about religion, but usually about their own beliefs. A public anti-Catholicism aimed at the Catholic Church, as I think dissipated hugely, even in the time that I have been here. And the rhetoric you would have got from unionists, if you'd looked at it back in the 80s and compared it to now, is totally different. All right, so you still have the two groups, but the identity, the way the identity expressed, changes quite dramatically over time.
And I think one of the things you've been doing recently is you are the flag commissioner. You've spent a long time counting flags, and they probably are one of the most visual manifestations of just those kind of cultural identities you're talking about. So just for those people who are listening and kind of don't know your life with flags, I know you've got an office full of flags. What was counting flags like over the years, and what do flags tell us?
Well, I ought to, for anybody that doesn't know, and I suspect most of the people on this line do know, you know, in Northern Ireland, the placing of flags on lampposts demarcating effectively territory is very common. I think in the work we've done, we've shown that it became particularly, and this is the interesting bit, after the signing of the 98 agreement. And also interestingly, it looks like it was really evolved actually as a conflict, because the UDA, the two loyalist paramilitary groups, the UDA and the UDF, were deeply in conflict with each other in 2000, 2001. And actually the real development of lots of flags being put up on lampposts seems to have been between them, demarcating really? Protestant areas with paramilitary flags. So there's a little interesting backstory. So people have always displayed flags, as they do all over the world on particular occasions, and the 12th of July were those sort of occasions. What you get after that, and this is quite interesting, and my good friend Gordon Gillespie, I think, was the one who pointed this out to me first, is that they start getting put all over lampposts for one reason and or because they're able to do it because they can buy lots of cheap flags. So, you know, formerly, if you bought a flag, it was an expensive thing. If you put it outside your Orange Hall, you took it down because you looked after it. All right, it wasn't a cheap thing to buy flags. Once you got you know, mass production of these things, they develop. They order thousands of them in, and they start demarcating space. And really, because they don't value them, they also don't take them down. So instead of just marking this space in the summer months, they start marking the space all year round. And if we're trying to create a more shared Northern Ireland with less fear, this becomes a problem. And we pointed this out in the early noughties in some of our reports. And And civil service took this up. And it's one of those bizarre phone calls you have when a senior civil servant rang me up and said, well, Dominic, we take your point that this is a problem. And we've got a new policy we're going to bring in. Policy was hopeless, by the way. But what we'd like you to do is to test whether it's working. And he said, so how would you do this? And I just chatted with a colleague of mine, Clifford Stevenson and Gordon Gillespie, and we wondered how we'd do this. And we came up with this idea that we'd count them all 3 times a year on every main road in Northern Ireland. That's what we did for 5 years. We drove, it took 11 days and we did every main road. And we counted every object, including memorials, murals, on all of that space for 5 years to see if the shared space flags protocol policy the government had brought in had made a difference. And after 5 years of doing all that driving, we concluded it made not a scrap of difference. Indeed, quite interestingly, and this is where you start to learn about how all this thing works. A community relations worker up here, a guy called Derek, pointed out to me after I'd done 4 years of this, that I was being used as a research excuse for them not doing anything. So every time, by this time the assembly was up and running around 2010, that the first and deputy first minister were asked, what are you doing about the flags problem? They would answer, we've got some Queen's researchers looking at it. Even though by this time we'd given them 4 reports showing that nothing is working out there. And eventually I stopped taking the funding because I realized that in a way I was their excuse for not doing anything. Ironically, under the Fresh Start Agreement, where in 2016, they came up with this idea of a commission to look at flags, to look at memorials, to look at to look at murals, all sorts of commemorative practice. And it involved all of the parties. It involved 7 members of the political parties and 8 independents. And I looked at it and I thought, got to put myself forward here, try and have a go at this. So I became chair of this commission. So I then spent 4 years, I think in total 900 hours, engaging with the political parties over a way forward. So I ended up, having done all of this work, I ended up actually chairing this commission to try and deal with, they were particularly interested in flags on public buildings, but all of this range of stuff. So that was how I got into this life of flags. But as anybody will tell you, they do play a very specific role that anybody in Northern Ireland, you start a conversation, will start talking about.
And fundamental to what we're speaking about here, of course, is the power of flags, their symbolic value.
Yeah.
But their power, I mean, their terrifying power to provoke and to cause violence and to cause deaths and things like that. Is there any way to dilute that power? You know, I guess I'm thinking this, is that when I was young, flags, the national flag, was something that one treated with great respect. It belonged to particular places, and there were things that one didn't do with it. Nowadays, of course, one can quite happily wear a Union Jack atop of one's head, or Stars and Stripes underpants.
Yeah.
These things, but that doesn't seem to have somehow or other taken from the power of flags.
I'm not sure, Joe, that Americans who really care for their flag would necessarily appreciate Stars and Stripes underpants. Perhaps. I think you could probably find them saying that's not how you should be wearing your American flag. Right. But I know exactly what you mean.
It is there.
Firstly, I think in principle, all of these things can change over time. And let's think of something that was sectarian and then becomes not sectarian. Yeah. Guy Fawkes Day in England. I mean, it clearly develops as a sectarian ritual. You're burning a Catholic on top of a bonfire. I speak as a Catholic who grew up in England, and I used to burn the guy on top of the bonfire. Not for a moment did I ever feel it was sectarian. And for obvious reasons, as the context changed, Guy Fawkes, you might like it or not like it, but it doesn't really, in a place called Lewes, I think in Sussex, it still does. But in the main, it has, it doesn't have that sense. So the meaning of these things can change, and they also change dependent upon context. So that the Union flag and the tricolour, I don't think mean the same in every place or in any place. So I will consistently argue when people say I should be allowed to fly the tricolour, this is my island, or I should be allowed to fly the Union flag, you know, we're part of the United Kingdom or whatever. I would always argue with them. I understand that, but there's a context in Northern Ireland which makes both of those flags problematic. You know, the meaning of a tricolour in Armagh is not the same as one in Wicklow. All right, it just isn't. All right, and so context is. So can you reduce that? I think you can. So you can find ways of producing context. I would like to see ways that we use the Irish tricolour in more official ways in the north than we do, because I think it should be a regular part of expressions of Irishness in the north in a very official way. And I think that would be a reasonable reflection of the Good Friday Agreement. All right, we found that very difficult to do. But I think over time, in a short period of time, people would just take it as natural. I honestly think that it would just become, well, we know why we fly this flag. So I think the answer is you can do all of those sorts of things. You've got to think about how you do it. You've got to engage with the problem.
Okay. And one thing, Dominic, I mean, you touched on it earlier about kind of flags and bonfires, and you said yourself, it's young men or groups of men. So, I mean, in that sense of that problematic, that lots of the issues around life in the north were very gendered, largely men. What have you observed about women's contributions and how they've been valued in the peace building processes that you've been involved in? And also when you look at issues like space or shared space, buy-in of reshaping gender politics, does that help?
I think it's made an enormous difference. I have to say, one of the lasting experiences I had in the 1990s, which had a profound impact on me, was that I ended up working with the Women's Coalition, right from when they were meeting in Belfast in circles and having discussions. And I was asked, I was very friendly with a number of the younger women working in that area through Queen's, and because parades were an issue, they asked me in to talk about them, and I found it really. If I'm to be honest, it was the first political space in Northern Ireland I felt remotely comfortable in, which is sort of ironic, since on a number of occasions I was the only man sitting in the room. But it taught me so much. And the way that they conducted themselves through that period, I still think is fantastic. And I still think it's inspiring. And whilst ironically, I'm not sure if their main focus was to try and increase the representation of women in politics. And I have to say, if you look back statistically, I'm not sure how successful that was. But in terms of impacting the way that the peace process moved forward, I think they were amazing. I've heard it said, I couldn't evidence this, I was standing outside the buildings when they were negotiating inside, that much of the victim stuff would not have got into the agreement, even the little bit that was there, if the Women's Coalition hadn't been pushing that forward. And there's no doubt over the years that you can see that. I mean, you know, women stretch right across the political spectrum in the north, as they do everywhere, and it's always important to remember that. But there have been quite a few spaces, all right, through which women work, which have made engagement in Northern Ireland through those spaces possible, all right. And you can't really look at a peace process without looking at all of those gendered implications that exist. In fact, colleagues up at University of Ulster have done some great works around gender and peace processes, and the difference it makes. And also it becomes much more complicated. I mean, as I already said, Pride itself has become a really interesting space. It's fascinating that Pride in Belfast has lots of sponsorship. Lots of the clubs and pubs sponsor the events in Pride, sponsor the parade when we have one, in a way that neither St. Patrick's Day or the 12th of July have. In some senses, It's become a space much more distinctive than either of those, and much more popular with young people in many ways than either of those. So I think looking at that gendered space, and Belfast has changed so much around that. I mean, it really is amazing how Belfast has moved into a different sort of space in that sense. And I'll just put this on the table as well. I think because of that, this could be famous last words, we're not in danger. Whenever I hear journalists talk about going back to 1969 or going back to any of that sort of thing, I hate to be rude, but that's real rubbish. That's real easy, cliched stuff. The society we live on now in Northern Ireland is dramatically different from the one we had 50 years ago. It really is. And therefore, any idea that history repeats itself and you're going to end up in another round of conflict, I think is the totally wrong way of looking at that stuff.
And I just press you a little bit on that, Dominic, only because you told us a little bit earlier about a report that was drawn up in the 1950s, which you said about intercommunity relations in the north of Ireland, if I heard you properly, that you said could be read as readily today and is as relevant today as it was then. I'm not too sure how that told us.
So what that prejudice and tolerance in Ulster does is it looks at the minutiae of how social relationships work between Protestants and Catholics in a small town. It identifies the ordinary things that people do to work together, but also, as we know in this place and telling, understand that when you're in a mixed group, the sort of conversations you have to deal with the fact that you've got people from different backgrounds in it, and that way of working. And I think if you read that now, you can still see that in Northern Ireland. I mean, the division hasn't gone away.
Right.
So it absolutely hasn't gone away. We're still a divided society in that sense. But we're firstly in the way we talk about equality, we're a more equal society. Catholics are now central to our, civil service, to our legal system, in the police. They're in all sorts of spaces, in the middle classes, growing middle classes, in the business sector. If you try to paint a picture of our society today, it certainly looks nothing like you would have found in the early 60s, in the 60s and 70s. However, we are still a divided society. And what that book does from all that time ago is identify some of those practices. And when a student today reads it, if ever I get a student from Tyrone, I almost throw the book to them and say, read that, tell me if it still works or not. And most of the feedback I get back from them and say, do you know what, obviously lots of things have changed, but it's, I can still see this in social relationships in Tyrone even now.
Great. And I see
the big thing in the last, sorry, no, I was just going to say that, I mean, just thinking, just popped into my head, but I mean, thinking about a lot of things you've been saying and the whole idea that, all the years you've been there, the way the place has changed. I've seen the last year and a half, we've had COVID, we've had lockdowns. You've had this big shared experience, which is not favouring one community over the other. It's a pandemic. But also, obviously, during the lockdown, you had empty spaces. Yeah. So is there any, do you see, I mean, it's a very unfair question in a way, it's very instantaneous, but do you see anything that comes back out of that kind of absence of day-to-day life where there may have been changes there simply because people left their space, their own houses, or do we now just go back to where we were?
In a way, Mike, we've yet to see because we haven't gone back to using them again and see how we use them. Now, there were some very interesting practices, particularly in first lockdown. The commemorative practices around and the supportive practices around the NHS were amazing. So you got expressions of political support from the NHS right across the political spectrum. Distant Republican groups put up banners supporting workers in the NHS, loyalist groups. Now, they may have done it in different ways, but it's still quite an interesting thing to note that right across the political spectrum here, there is support for a good public health system. Okay, now I know, and I know lots of loyalists connected that to a Britishness and did murals with the NHS and the rainbow and the Union flag and connected it. But nevertheless, it does serve to remind us that across the spectrum here, people share lots of political interests in common. And whilst I'm not trying to say that it therefore, in some ways, overcame the differences we had, it would be difficult to find another circumstance, another issue where you could go to every area of Belfast and find the same symbols being used in support of the NHS. And I think that's quite telling. So it has had some sorts of impacts. Where we await to see, I mean, and I think we're now talking about a problem that all cities have, is we have a dying city centre in terms of shops, in terms of the big central shop in Belfast was a Debenhams. That's going to go. And whilst I've already suggested we have quite a lot of successes in Belfast in reinventing the city centre as a shared space, which I think has been one of the great successes of the peace process, we've got to do a lot of thinking about how the contemporary city centre is going to work. So after this process, there's going to be a lot of interesting discussions around what we do in those spaces.
A question here from Bill German, and it's one to which I can give an answer myself indeed, wonders if there are still Palestinian flags in the Falls and Israeli flags in the Shankill. I was up there 2 days ago, and indeed there are probably even more than this week than there had been indeed previous to that. But I wonder if I could just add a further question to that, Dominic, and this may be beyond your competence, but I wonder if this is an entirely new phenomenon. If one were to go back in history, say 50 or 100 years ago, if the different parties identified with any other conflicts around the world and appropriated those, so to speak, in their own, that's a total.
Joe, I suspect the answer is yes. I mean, I suspect if we went and looked at early forms of unionism during the Boer War, you know, if you look at those issues over the years, those international issues, unionism and nationalism has sided in different ways. I mean, you know, some of these, if you look in the detail of history, can be difficult to try and get your hand around. I mean, as we know, the state of Israel in part came about with the Stern Gang as our, blowing up British soldiers. So it becomes quite interesting how that, how that's now seen. And I think, like a lot of people, I don't tend to read too much. I mean, the Republican movement certainly has had historical links with the PLO, particularly, and Palestinian. I'm not saying it's not deeply meant, but I do think some of the connection between loyalism and Israel and the use of the Israeli flag. There is, in fact, a flag which is the joining together of the Ulster banner and the Israeli flag that you can find around the place. Yeah, because they've both got a star in the centre. Now, if I understand correctly, the Ulster banner, of course, the six-pointed star wasn't the Star of David. It was the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. Nevertheless, what you end up is 2 flags that rather easily map upon each other. And that has been done. So there's 2 versions of it, actually. One with a clenched red fist, a UFF one, and more recently one with an open red hand, which is a cross between the Israeli and the Ulster flag. There's a danger in all of this stuff of overreading and trying to look for something which is a bit more complex and linked than it probably is, when we know that we have people, we're in a situation where if that lot want one thing, we must want the other thing. And I don't want to say that people don't think about it, but in some senses I see the symbols as really playing that role.
That's great.
Okay. Dominic, so obviously one thing, you've done a lot of work on commemoration in the last few years, looking at what's been going on about various centenaries, and you were unfortunately critical of historians and their role. You concluded in one article that, quote, and I'm going to quote you directly, back it yourself, the historians may be there on TV, etc., for very noble reasons. However, if my argument about the synchronic nature of remembrance practice is correct, what they're doing is embellishing the symbolic capital, the legitimacy of the rituals.
Yeah.
So, Dominic, if commemoration doesn't need historians on television, etc.
Yeah. So here's the argument, all right? Commemoration is a vital part of how social groups, particularly nations, create, if you like, a sacred identity. They're how they parcel off bits of history and make them special. So they are ultimately completely political events, and they are political events about the present and about the future. The people taking a part are talking about their identity now and what it is, what they want it to be in the future. So a commemoration, whilst it looks like some sort of depiction of history, is always a very contemporary and political event. And what's fascinating, and here's something I think should be a debate on, is that in the popular media, they will always say, well, we've got a commemoration coming along, we better get the historians to talk about it. And of course, the minute you put a historian who's a professor from this place or a professor from that place on that, you are adding social capital to this political event. So if you take me as being right, the commemorations are always these political events, you're now adding social capital. Frankly, doesn't matter what the historian says, but the people who are involved in the commemoration already have what they need, which is the legitimacy that's coming out of that process. All right. So in that sense, all right, historians are involved in a contemporary political process. And what I suppose agitates me is that you don't get political scientists on, you don't really get anthropologists, you don't get political psychologists being asked by the media. Why don't you get them? Is because they are the sort of disciplines that deconstruct the commemoration and give you an explanation of why people are commemorating, and they do not really take the history bit as important. This isn't about what happened 100 years ago. This is about politics now. So which tells you something culturally, maybe about Ireland, that we, and this gets me in a lot of trouble, whatever, that we give history probably too great a status. We put too much weight on it as telling us who we are, ignoring all of those other factors. So in a way, I wrote that as a bit of a bit of tongue in cheek with all my friends in the School of History here, and I do have lots of them. I feel like saying some of my best friends are historians. That's my point. Is that it rather the historian being involved rather takes the history, that takes the commemoration at face value. It doesn't deconstruct it, and I think we sometimes need to do that. That's not to say, I mean, the historians have produced fantastic histories of commemoration, which is vitally important, all of which I think backs up the argument I'm making, by the way, that history is about the moment, commemoration is about the moment it's in, not really about the past it's commemorating.
That's really lovely stuff, Dominic, actually, and I can't let you go, even though we're coming towards the time, without a number of points that are made here. And I've got a question I want to put to you before you leave us too. And Mike McClelland wants you to repeat, please, the title and author of the Tyrone book that you mentioned earlier. Please, can you say that once more?
It's Prejudice and Tolerance in Ulster, and it's Rosemary Harris.
Thanks very much.
And I think it's an amazing piece of ethnography, precisely because it's lasted time.
Beautiful. And a comment here from Patrick O'Sullivan, who I think is supporting what you were saying there, and refers to Robert Hewison, who invented the heritage industry, says that heritage is not about the past, it is about the future, which is rather nice, actually. And he has another quick question here, actually, and I don't know that we can go down there, but he points out he concerns about the word indigenous. And that terms, people who track the ways in which they are I've lost the term, ill-served by traditional academic disciplines, especially by anthropology. Where do you place yourself in those debates, for or against?
I mean, anthropology has a lot to answer for. I mean, anthropology in a way invented the word tribe, and that was disastrous. We now use the word tribe. We use the word tribe about here, and it's a deeply problematic term to use, because what we were doing is we were going to other parts of the world and we were categorizing people as we wanted to see them, not how they lived, so that I think even the use of the word tribe, I wince. I mean, it's now in popular discourse. I wince when people say, Protestants and Catholics, two tribes. Anthropology has done no favors to itself over quite a period. I hope that in the sort of critical anthropology world we live in now, we're making amends for some of those mistakes,
some of the
which
sins
fed
of
racism.
some of the sins of the past. And a question here
Sins of
from
the past,
Tim.
indeed, Joe.
I have no idea what this question is about, but Tim wonders actually, why did you stop the T-shirt videos? They were great fun.
Oh, yeah. I've never thrown a T-shirt away, and I have about 160 of them. And I like doing, so whilst in lockdown, I thought I would spoof up doing a history of the T-shirt. So I was doing my own videos, and I got to about 8, and I wanted to finish them off, and I never got round to it. The weather went down. But maybe if we ever, this summer, I'll see if I can get my last 2 episodes out on the history of the T-shirts. Very important work, Joe.
I've got one more question for you, Dom, and it's maybe 2 questions. I don't know. What's your favorite flag? Invent a flag, or United Ireland. Invent a flag for that. You must have given us. Surely already you've sketches.
No, listen. All of my inventions have been trying to come up with a new flag for Northern Ireland, which is unproblematic. And I had an interesting idea of using the red hand, which I think for lots of good reasons still works as a symbol in the north. But you would have that red hand would be lots of different sorts of hands. You could have a woman's hand and a child's hand. You then have to ignore, of course, that the idea of the hand is that it's the bloody red hand, which then complicates this.
Absolutely.
But I took my flag around with the BBC around the streets of Belfast, and unanimously the people of Belfast said it was awful. which I think in this place is probably a good start.
Indeed. Well, so much for the man who's in charge of the Flags Commission. You're not in the business of designing them, thankfully. Mike, what have we coming up next week? Can you tell us?
I can tell you, yes, indeedy. Here we go. So next week we have work. There we go. Next week we have Alva Darcy and David Walsh, both of whom are published poets in their own right, but also scholars of poetry. And David Walsh, David Wheatley. Sorry, apologies there, David. Alva Darcy and David Wheatley. Basically, they've just published, which is on the bottom left there. It's coming out in June, I believe, A History of Irish Women's Poetry. Big collection, something they've been working on for years. So I think it's going to be a fascinating chat with poets who are also kind of, as it were, looking at and exploring the history of women's poetry on this island. So that's next week.
Thank you.
But for now, Dominic, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. Great fun.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
And I don't want people to go for just one more second, because I want to actually apologize to anybody who tried to join us on Zoom. We had a difficulty with Zoom this evening. And you know, on YouTube, this is Zoom. You do know that you can watch it on YouTube live at any time, actually, as well as watching it here. And also bear in mind that if you turn to YouTube, then you can watch not just not today's, but just all the history of the various ones we've had over the years. So bear that in mind. Thanks very, very much. And